at 6, so we may be pushing our time a little bit. Mr. Newman could not be with us. He is out of town on business, so he was unable to join us today. We have called this meeting for the purpose of affording consideration to whether or not we need to sell a certain amount of bonds. We're down, we have 25 million remaining, and do we sell 20 at this time, or do we go with 25? Without any further delay, I'll call on our representative from Raymond James to get this meeting started.
Good afternoon. I'm Lee Bressler with Raymond James and appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk to you all about your upcoming bond issue. And we put together a presentation which is giving you a handout as well as should be on your computer screen. We'll have it on the big screen here. And feel free to interrupt me as we go through this with any questions that you have. So the introduction, the overview is that you all went to the voters and they approved $210 million worth of bonds, and you all have already issued $185 million. So that leaves $25 million. And right now, from what I understand, you all are underway and sort of committed on about $20 million worth of projects. It was about $21 million, but there's about $1 million left from the last bond issue. So there's about $20 million of projects already either in the works or about to get into the works. And I'm sure, and I know that there's another $5 million of projects that are out there that could easily be moved into the equation if you decide to go that route. So we really focused on $20 and $25 million issues. And again, the key factor is the millage rate. I know you all feel very strongly about trying to keep the millage rate exactly right where it is. And that could be challenging depending on some economic circumstances that go on in the future, which none of us really know what's going to happen there. So the goal is to keep the millage at the 13.83 level, although the bond documents require you to raise the millage to whatever it takes to pay off the bond. So the bondholders will be fine. It's just you all may have to explain why the millage had to go up beyond that rate. So at the 13.83 level and the current assessed valuation, the debt service on the bond issues will be greater than the millage. So what happens there? And that's what we're going to talk about is if the assessed valuation grows, then it bails you out of the problem. And there's some money in the sinking fund that we think can be drawn down. How much can be drawn down is the question, because it could get to low enough levels where you should be concerned, or it may stay at levels where you're comfortable. Yes, sir.
Just for clarification, the last time we came together for this purpose, we're looking at selling some bonds. I seem to recall the presentation included a caution that if we approved it, the revenue would not be sufficient to retire the bonds. We would have to go into our sinking fund. Is that, and now you're saying that's going to be the case?
Depending on the growth rate of the assessed valuation, and we're going to talk about historicals in just a second. So if you assumed, it depends on what you assume for the growth rate. We were looking at 1% and 2% growth rates as being two scenarios to look at. If one year you had a negative growth rate, again, there would always be money to pay off the bonds, but your millage rate would have to go up to provide for that excess money. So you're not going to be defaulting on any bonds. You're just going to be raising the millage above the level you told the voters you were going to be able to keep it. Okay, so.
I got a question.
I'm sorry.
Mr.
Bamberg.
What did we tell the voters when we voted on the bond? What was the rate that we used on that?
Well, the ballot, I think, just says you raise the rate to whatever it takes, but the publicity, the public relations, where's the public relations person? I think said we'll keep it at the same level, and I think that was the 13.83. That seems to be the magic level because it was, promised that you wouldn't be raising taxes above that level.
Okay. That's what I was thinking.
Just to follow up on Mr. Bamberg's comment and what I had said previously, that's I guess my biggest concern. We had this conversation not too terribly long ago, and it was voiced then. Hold it. You're saying you want us to sell some bonds, knowing going in, we're not going to generate sufficient revenue to
We've got to grow our way out of it, right?
and Ms. Bamberg, I don't want to, excuse me, I don't want to put you on the spot because you're like green wood. You said, no, you won't even burn. But,
She's not that green.
but our sinking fund, what is the status of it right now?
My understanding is it has about a year in it right now. So there's sufficient amount in there right now to pay principal, and as of June 30th, there was sufficient in there to pay principal and interest for 1 year.
Strictly for the outstanding bonds, June 30.
Yes, sir.
That does not include an additional 20 or 25 million.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
We're going to go over those specific
I'm sorry,
points.
Mr.
Yeah.
Cheatham.
And I'm sure we'll cover this in here, but I think and excuse me from just being blunt, but I think this is somewhat a damned if we do, damned if we don't situation, to where obviously if we have to sell these bonds and there's a chance that that millage raises above the 13.83, or we don't proceed with the projects, and then that could cost us millions of dollars more to build those, to do those projects. So I guess, obviously, we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in depth, but I guess that's my concern, and I think what some of the board members want to see is the chance of that moving up above 13.83 versus how much it could cost the taxpayers more if we wait on those projects.
Well, I know some of the projects have a sense of urgency because if you don't start them this year, you have to build some shelters in that, but some other folks here can probably give more detail on that.
And I guess that's my biggest point. We can do whatever we want to. You know, we can shut this discussion down, say, motion sell 25, and just go on about our business. Because no matter what we do or do not do, those bonds must be repaid, and it is absolutely imperative, or it's a requirement, that we will amend our millage to cover that. We have some new people, and just so everybody understands, that's a given. So what we do or don't do, if we approve it, be prepared, we may have to increase that millage rate, and we all know what that will entail.
All right, if you all can look on page 4, we were trying to get some guidance as to what we should assume for the growth rate on the assessed valuation. And we look at the, for the last 20 years, it was a 7% growth rate. Of course, you had some 24%, growth years in there as well as some negative years. Really, it was, I guess, about 3 years ago. If you look at the last 10 years, it was about a 3% growth rate. And if you looked at the last 5 years, it was about a 1% growth rate with that 1 year with a negative. So again, we were looking at this as, okay, what do we assume? And we thought that if we started with 1% and 2%, that those were a couple of pretty base cases that we thought would make some sense. In addition, the sinking fund, which is really like a reserve fund, traditionally was kept at 1 year's debt service, and that's where it is now. But the legislative auditor has sort of come out with some new guidelines and guidance to say, you know what, that's probably overfunded. You're charging the people too much in taxes. You should only keep about 50%. And that's a recommendation, and I think that's generally where you all are trying to end up in any case, whether you issue more bonds or not. Is that correct?
It wasn't, I guess, a full recommendation. We really get to decide which level we want to keep it. Legislative auditors really just said you can't go over a year. So
And
as
in the
long as it's under that year, we get to decide which level or which percentage we feel comfortable with.
And in the past, when it was over a year, they forced you all to take some of that money and pay off bonds, or defease bonds.
Correct. The legislative auditor has started requiring external auditors to start looking at that more heavily. And if it is overfunded or over the
So the 1 year is really a cap, and you're maybe looking at decreasing it anyway, just to keep the legislative auditor off your back. Yes, sir.
Mr. Bass?
Ms. Bamberger, at what level are you comfortable?
I'm glad I'm not the only one on the spot here.
Like, hey, she won't even burn, she's so new, listen.
I know. I honestly, our general fund reserve level is 15%. As long, that's what we target for our general fund. That's really the only policy this board has put in place. I'm comfortable going under a year. I actually would rather be good enough under a year that we have a cushion. I just don't want to go over that 1 year. 15% is low. I wouldn't want to always keep it at 15%, but if there's a year or two we do drop down to that low level, I'm fine with that as well. But I definitely don't think we should be sitting at this close to a year. I would like to get it a little bit lower, so start utilizing some of that sinking fund.
Okay, so the sinking fund, like I said, is your reserve fund. You use that to pay debt service when property taxes are not sufficient. We did assume a 95% collection rate, which we think is sufficient, but again, that's another question as well, is if there's delinquencies on the payments, then that would affect what you're doing. And we use the 1%, 2% growth, and the 20 and 25 million. Yes. Mm-hmm.
You're assuming a 95% collection rate, and I see the data here on the growth rate. What historically over the last 5 or 10 years has been the collection rate in our parish? Is 95% the average,
I
or
think
are
that's
we
conservative,
being very
right?
conservative?
That is conservative. I think from what I've seen, it's 96 to 98%.
Right.
Okay, thank
I
you.
mean, not extremely conservative, but yeah, I thought it was in the higher
So-
90s.
So we should be actually taking more than 95% on a historical basis.
Correct, probably 96, 97.
Okay.
Okay, so again, the question is your comfort with the 1% or 2% growth rate, your comfort with the sinking fund balance of between 15 and 40%. And, there's no requirement that you raise the millage if the tax revenues are not enough. You could come up with money from a different source. You could use other school board revenues, but then that creates a hole in your operating budget. So that's not good. But I am mentioning that just to say that you're not required to raise the millage. You could take the money from somewhere else within the budget, which creates its own issues. So we looked at 5 scenarios. We looked at 2 of 20 million and 3 at 25 million, and I'll explain that in just a minute. This is a summary that shows what the sinking fund balances go down to. As you can see, that 25 million at the 1% growth is pretty much wipes it out. The others are between the 15 and 36%. But why don't we jump into the numbers here on the next page, on page 8. And let me run through the columns here, and then you'll see similar columns on the other pages. So this is the 20 million with the 1% growth. So you'll see this, the first column is calendar year. The second is the calendar year debt service. This is what it looks like today. So you've got 13 million 2 of debt service, and it stays pretty close to that level really until you get down to 2033 when you start to drop. And let's focus on what it looks like from 2019 to 33, because you'll be able to drop the millage at that point if you haven't issued other bonds. And then we show a $20 million issue. We assume 4% for the interest rate. That is conservative. You could issue at lower interest rates than that, but we're trying not to push the envelope on every single assumption. So there's a little bit of room there. We've got what the interest would be. This would be the debt service of about $1.5 million a year on these bonds. So then we combine that with the existing debt service, and you're up to about $14.7 million in total debt service. The assessed valuation, we took the actual numbers for the current year, and again, we assume that 1% growth, and then we show what the millage revenue would be. So you can see that the millage revenue for 2021 is $13.5 million, and the debt service is $14.7 million. So there is a deficit, and that's why you see on the very far right-hand column the sinking fund dropping from $9.114 million, and it goes down. It hits bottom around $3.5 million in 2028, and then starts to pick back up. But again, once you get past 2034, the millage could start dropping just because the debt service is dropping then. Any questions on this particular chart? Yes, sir.
The 4% coupon you're using, what was the last bond that we issued? What was the coupon on it?
I think it was probably 3%, maybe less than that. We can try to look that up.
So
and
we're
see.
being pretty conservative
You
there
are,
also.
but I mean-
Okay, just want to make sure.
Yes. Mhm. So if you turn on page 9, this is a $25 million issue with a 1% growth. And if we just skip all the way to the right-hand column, you can see we get down to below $1 million in the sinking fund. So this would be where you'd sound the alarms and start to be concerned about it. And this would really stretch what you can and can't do as far as your ability to not raise the millage. The next scenario is 20 million with a 2% growth rate, and that helps you a lot as well because it's 2% every, the first year and every year, and once you start compounding the growth rates, it gets you into much more comfortable territory. You get down to around 5 million or so in the sinking fund, and that's based on total debt service of around 15 million, so you're around a third at that point. And then you can look at the 25 million at 2%, and you get down to around the $3.5 million range. So it's about 25%. And this final scenario was, yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to give Mr. Downey a second to talk to us here. Have you spoken with Mr. Edmondson and what his kind of thought process is as far as a 1% or a 2% or?
I actually talked to him a couple times to try to get some background on the historical data in the past 5 years versus 10 years versus 20 years, and what he would be comfortable with in terms of us moving forward to try to estimate property value increases. And he's told me on more than one occasion that he's very, very comfortable with a 2.5%. So he actually said between 2 and 3%, and he thought 2.5% was very conservative. So that was just feedback from our tax assessment.
Thank you, Mr. Downey.
That's good to know. And then on the final version, the alternate 25 million, this was Ms. Bamberg's suggestion that we add a couple of columns with interest income from the bond proceeds and on the sinking fund, and then the state revenue sharing, the 70,000 a year that you all receive. If we throw that in there, then we get to about a 15% sinking fund target with the 1% growth on the 25 million.
Real quick, Ms. Bamberg, you added those in there because those are recurring sources of revenue that will continue to come in as opposed to what we were looking at earlier with what Raymond James was giving us. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
So it's just revenues outside of the millage revenue.
But alternate sources we could use to pay the bonds, correct?
Right, those are revenue sources into the sinking fund.
Okay.
Both of those are over there. The state revenue sharing is linked to the property taxes that are being assessed, which is why that goes in there, and of course, the interest is being
Okay.
So you're not creating a hole in the operating budget. This is money that's flowing in anyway.
already over.
Right.
Thank you.
So this was the presentation we prepared, and again, there's no easy answer to this. It's really, what you guys want to do as far as, one, issuing bonds at all, two, doing the 20 million, which would cover the projects that you've already pretty much, tied into, and then, not leaving the 5 million out there or leaving it out there as an option.
I have one other question. Fees for bond issuance, how is that paid to you per bond issuance, and how would we be paying the fees to your firm to manage this bond for us? Bond sale?
It comes out of the proceeds of the bonds, just like the bond council fees, and I think our fees are pegged to their fee, which goes up as the size goes up, but it's not a straight percentage. It's a.
So if I were to issue 20 million one time and then 5 million in another issue, what would be the two fees associated with that as opposed to just doing one $25 million bond issue?
It would be a little bit more expensive, I think. I don't know.
Just speaking for the Attorney General's fee schedule for bond counsel, over the 20 million issue and the 5 million issue, separated would be a little bit more than a 25 million bond.
A little as in a Chevy or a little as in a
Can you give us some
bicycle?
exact, I think
Yeah.
you're asking for exact dollars.
Right.
Give us exact numbers.
It's a sliding scale. We have a formula on the computer that runs that for us. I couldn't do it in my head, but I'm happy to give you that number.
Can you
Clearly-
access it while we're meeting here today?
I cannot, it's an algorithm that's on my computer.
It's so much for the first 5 million, and then each million after that, it goes up by a certain amount, and it's,
Can you get that and see that it is sent to every member of this school board and the superintendent?
can somebody
Mr.
email you
Downey?
the formula, or?
I have a
But
question
it
in
is,
terms,
you're correct, it is, selling 5 million by itself is not as efficient as throwing it in with the 20 million, so.
so I've had this question asked of me and I don't know the answer. So what is the market? Is there a greater market for a $20 million sale versus a $5 million? Or do you have the same players interested in a $5 million bond sale versus a $25 million bond sale?
Yeah, the market for a 20 or 25 is about the same, but when you get to a 5 million, you might lose some interest from some of the bigger players that don't want to get into that level.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to just tell y'all, thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's very helpful in putting these numbers together. I think when we first started talking about this, there was, no, I'm not gonna say a panic, but there was concerns about, okay, if we go ahead and pull this 25 million, you know, where's that gonna put us versus the money that we could save without having to build the tornado shelter wings. And from the get-go, I've thought that the best practice of being responsible with our money would be to go ahead and pull this 25 million. And I think after looking at this presentation, I actually feel even a little more comfortable moving forward with that. And in a conversation that I was having with Mr. Downey while we were up here, you know, instead of having to raise that 13.83 if something did go wrong and we weren't getting a 2.5% or 2%, we could pull that from our general fund to temporarily offset that and not have to go and raise that millage. Am I correct on that?
Correct, but then most of the money in your general fund's going somewhere, so you'd have to figure
Sure.
out, you know, that. But technically you could, it's just, you'd have to solve the problem on the other side of the fence.
Correct. So I just, like I said, I really appreciate the presentation on this, and I'm a firm believer that the millions of dollars we're gonna save in getting these projects started and moving forward with them is gonna outweigh the risk of what might happen if it doesn't perform, and I'd like to see us sell all 25 million at one time, and now we see that will also save us money from splitting it up into two.
Ms. Brotherton?
I guess my question is, if we sell 20 million now, and then we sell 5 million later, what is the time frame? How soon can you do that? Or do you have to wait so many years, or?
Well, again, I guess that question has multiple sides to it. If you're asking, you know, to get more comfortable with not raising the millage, or you're just saying legally, how soon after could you issue the bonds? I mean, theoretically, you know, the schedule we're looking at right now is your fiscal year ends June 30th, your audit comes in sometime in December, and then that's when we start putting together the offering document, you know, for investors. And we'll put that out there and we'll get a rating. The rating is good for about 90 days or so. But, you know, one of the questions is, are you planning on issuing additional bonds? You know, I don't, like, from an efficiency standpoint, it doesn't make sense to issue now and then issue a month or two later. You know, I would say probably 6 months or 9 months or so. And again, your construction schedule also may depend on if you're doing it over the summer and, you know, when you need the money, you know, from that perspective too. So you might wait another year, you know, get a new audit report, do it then. Legally, you could probably do it a couple of months later or something like that, or 3 months later. I mean, it's just, you know, it would look kind of strange to come back a month or so later just to do that tag
Yeah.
end. It's really, you know, this should set you, I would guess maybe for a year, this should be what you plan on spending, the next year.
Mr. Bass?
Just real quick, it's my understanding, I just want to make sure I have this right. When we sell this, we have 3 years to utilize the funds that we're raising in this bond issue, correct?
Sort of, yeah, so actually, what the tax code says is that you have to have reasonable expectations to spend 85% of the bond proceeds within 3 years.
So I guess to my next question, maybe someone from our group, do we have reasonable expectation to spend that additional $5 million? And that may be something Mr. Babineau or Mr. Norwood could answer for us, just to make sure we cover our bases there.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Certainly, you've got plans already for the 20. They'll take care of the project cost for the 3 wings that are being designed right now. The other 5 was intended for the wing at Parkway High School, which the board has not taken any action on. So if you have other projects in mind, then certainly.
Not to interrupt you, but we will, 3 years is plenty of time for us to get that money spent in South Bossier.
Yeah, agree. Any other question?
Mr. Downey?
I was involved in a conversation this morning at the superintendent's meeting, and they were talking about the condition of the market, the investors, and I'm in over my head, so just help me out here. And there were actually scenarios discussed where 45 million was sold, but 48 million was generated. What type of scenario would create that type of return?
Well, generally, we're selling a certain par amount of bonds. That's what was approved by voters. But the bond issue can be structured in any number of ways, and that involves par bonds, which are sold at 100 cents on the dollar, discount bonds, which are sold under 100 cents on the dollar, and premium bonds. And generally, it depends on what you all are looking for. If you're looking for excess proceeds, you can use premium bonds, but they're more expensive than par bonds are. So if you're looking for the lowest borrowing cost, then you want to structure it with par bonds. But if you're looking for the most proceeds, then you use premium bonds, but those have a higher.
What case scenario would warrant the issuance of premium bonds, and what would that look like versus par bonds?
Well,
So with
typically-
the 25 million or $20 million scenario, where we could potentially, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, generate more money than the face cost of the bond.
Well, typically, bonds are sold at negotiated sale, so that if you do have a premium, you just reduce the number of bonds you sell so that your proceeds equals what you're trying to do. So you wouldn't sell the full 25 million in that example. You would sell less to get the 25 million of proceeds. On a competitive sale, you put out the maturity schedule, and then you set up rules about how people can bid on it. But we can limit that as well to so that we don't have that problem. And chances are, though, that the people that bid to provide the extra proceeds won't have the lowest interest cost, so they won't win the bid from that perspective.
Well, like I said, I was involved in that conversation this morning. I didn't even know that was an option, and I don't know still how realistic an option that is.
Yeah, we would have to put it in the bid specs, and I think that would kind of complicate things. Typically what we want to say is you're selling 25 million, we want the lowest interest rate, and whichever company provides that gets the bonds.
So what would be the financial risk of us selling a premium bond versus a par bond?
Again, it's a higher interest cost.
So I hate to interrupt, but would a good example of that be a low fixed rate mortgage as opposed to a variable rate mortgage that can balloon over time, something of that nature?
No, these are fixed rate bonds, but the yield to investors is much higher when they pay a premium than when they buy it at a discount.
Some may recall, I can't remember how many years ago it was. I can't remember if we were the situation, but we got into a premium circumstance. And there was we're not talking millions of dollars, but there was a significant amount of funds generated, and it was inadvertent. It just happened to be the market and the way it from the time everything was, from bidding to closing.
Again, it's not free money, you're paying it back in the higher interest rate
Yeah.
over time. So it's not lagniappe, it's just a additional loan that you're
Mr.
getting.
Bamberg, did you have a question, sir?
No, but you read my mind, so I'll go ahead and with it. So as it is right now, the two projects that are on the board are Halton and Cope, which, in Benton. Three wings
Right,
that we would have to put storm shelters in if we delayed it all.
correct, yes,
And we can do all three of those projects within the 20 million.
yes.
And the assessor says 2 to 3 is conservative. We make it over the line at 1%. A coupon at 4% is conservative. It doesn't matter to me which way we go, but I think we should either do the 20 or the 25. I'm kind of okay either way. But, because I think, I don't know that we'll have, we got plenty of uses for $5 billion, but when is that gonna happen in the next year? I just don't know, you know?
It's, Ms.
Well, no,
Smith,
we're okay, we're covered by the 20 million. 80% of 25 million is 20 million, so we should expect to spend 80% of the bond if we go for the $25 million option, so that's not really a concern. The question is, do we want to borrow the money and not have an item for that? Or do we wait a year and see what it looks like, what we're looking for then? And I don't know how that changes the scenario, other than we may pay a little higher
we have projects
fees.
that are
to
listed
go ahead
now,
and-
we just haven't approved them, so it's there. But a good point. Ms. Smith?
I guess if I had a chart somewhere that could show me if we did the 20 million now and we did the 5 million in 2 years, what would be the difference? If we can't absorb the 25 million now, what is saying that we can absorb that in 2 years? What big difference is that going to make in the 20-year plan and add 2?
It's not going to really help. It's just a question of, do you stay with the 20 million and just do the 20 million of projects and build in a little bit more room for yourself to protect that millage rate? Or do you go with the 25 million now? Because doing the 5 million later in the next year or two doesn't really help you. You would have to wait 10 or 15 years to really see a benefit of doing that. Keeping the 5 million separate. If you're going to do the 5 million, if you want to be efficient, you should probably throw it in now, because trying to do a $5 million issue by itself, a year later, Brennan was just mentioning that there's not just financial advisor fees and bond counsel fees, but rating agency fees, offering statement fees, and other costs, will make it, there'll be a higher cost per bond on a $5 million issue.
So I'm to understand you're recommending the 25 million sale?
I'm suggesting that you've got 20 million of projects that you're pretty much committed to, if that's correct. And that doing a $20 million issue gives you a little bit more breathing room in different growth scenarios to not have to raise the millage. But if you're going to do the other 5 million, I think it makes more sense to just do it with this issue.
So on a savings of fees, counsel, and everything else, it would be more prudent for us to do the 25 million. That's your recommendation?
You're talking about 25 million either way. You're talking about 25 million together, or 20 and 5 million
I'm talking about 25 million in a one-time
versus,
splitting it up between 20 and 5.
correct.
And doing the
If
5
you're
in the
gonna do the
next
20
5 years. If you're going to do the 5 in the next 5 years, do 20 now and 5 in the next 5 years, your recommendation would be to go ahead and do the whole 25.
Yeah, again, you
Okay.
don't have breathing room until,
Ms. Bamberg, what's your opinion on that?
Good question.
till 2034.
Okay.
I agree. If we're going to use the 25, and if we feel like we have the projects for the 25, we've already discussed the bleachers and things that we added in, and so we already have some additional projects coming up. So if we plan to spend the 25 million, then I do recommend we go ahead and issue the 25 million. I think that we will be covered without having to raise the millage. Based on the projections and the conservative estimates, I think we'll be covered.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or Mr. Downey?
I just want to kind of restate this, so I'll make sure everybody understands, especially me. So if we intend to spend the $25 million within the next 5 years, it would be in our best interest, even though it's a slight risk, to sell it all now. Otherwise, sell the 20 now and wait beyond 5 years to spend the additional 5 million. Is that the conversation?
Yeah, I think the decision is between the 25 now and the 20 now. Splitting up the 25 doesn't really help you. It probably hurts you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wiggins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, Raymond James, are you giving us recommendations or options? Because I see so many get out of jail free card statements here. Raymond James, basement hypothetical. Raymond James shall have no liability. Raymond James not provide.
Correct. You're talking about the disclaimer?
Yes,
Yes.
that's a bunch of them.
This is what our legal department makes us put into every document that we give out.
We can have
What we've
full
done is
confidence.
we've created an analysis that shows, based on different assumptions, what the millage rate could be, what the sinking fund would be, and that type of thing. What you all are asking is it efficient, by waiting for the 5 million, does that get you past the hurdle? And what I was saying is that you don't really get past the hurdle until 2034. So I don't think you're planning on waiting that long to do the extra. So if it's going to be done in the next 15 years, it's still going to bump you up against that. The question is, are you all more interested in those $5 million of projects or in having a little bit more cushion on the millage? And that's not my recommendation. All we can do is present the assumptions, and you all have to tell us which one is more important.
Mr. Bass?
Just a minute, Mr. Bass. Moondog ain't finished yet. Go ahead, I'm just kidding.
Based on your presentation and Ms. Bamberg's eloquently put recommendation, I am going to make a motion that we sell the 25 million at one time. That's the motion I'd like to make, please.
I second.
I have a motion by Mr. Bass, second by Ms. Brotherton, that we proceed with authorizing the issuance of the final 25 million of bonds authorized by the 2010 bond program. Is there any further discussion, Mr.?
I just have a question. I guess I wasn't under the impression we were going to be voting on this tonight. I know I'm usually the guy that says, let's think about it before we vote on it. Obviously, if we vote on it here in committee, we've still got to vote on it at the board meeting, correct? So that
Yes,
would
sir,
give
that
us.
is correct. All we're doing is sending a recommendation. Of course, we are a committee of the whole, but we are forwarding a recommendation to the formal board for final action.
If I could just make a comment on that point
Yes.
as well. We'll be back to you in January for you to adopt an advertising resolution, which will be the first official action of this board. So at any point before that or after that, you guys can withdraw, go on their back. So we will be back.
Perfect, thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? I think we've sort of hit on everything. But before we call the vote, any questions, any further comments? If not, please vote. Let the record reflect as a unanimous vote. We have 2 members absent. We have 10 for it. Are there any other comments or questions? I do have one. I want to remind the gentleman with Raymond James that we do want you to provide us with the estimated fees,
Oh, absolutely.
as we
yes.
discussed earlier. And that'll be disseminated. If you send it to Mr. Downing, he will forward it on to all members of the board, or if you send it to Ms. Bamberg, however you choose to
Yes, that's not a problem.
do it. Anything else? Mr. Cheatham?